I think that the vast majority of Quebecers agree with our measures, and I think that it's important that Mr. Trudeau recognize that there is some work to do to stop the decline of French in Quebec.
As a Quebecer, as a Prime Minister, I will always be there to protect the French language. It's also important to protect the English-speaking minorities in Quebec. And that's why, as a federal government, we need to be there to protect the fundamental rights of any and all Canadians, regardless of where they live in the country.
Political reaction from Ottawa and Quebec after the province's National Assembly adopted Bill 96 earlier this week. The new law is meant to protect the French language in Quebec, but its critics worry about what it will mean for Anglophones, newcomers, and Indigenous people in the province. It limits the use of English in courts and public services, including healthcare, as well as other issues. So does the federal government have a role to play here? What does the political response tell us about what's to come? It's Thursday. I'm here with that issue. Chantal Hebert, Andrew Coyne, Althia and Elamin Abdelmahmoud. Good to see all of you. I know you all have a lot to say on this, but let's start with Chantal, given she lives in Quebec. What do you make of the federal government's response to this, and I guess how the Premier responded to them, Chantal?
I'm going to start with the Premier's response. The argument that the majority is for something is the exact reason why we have a Charter of Rights and Freedoms. It's not to protect majorities, it's to protect minorities. I suspect that when courts started ruling about same-sex marriage, the majority of Canadians may have had second thoughts. So much for that argument. The federal government certainly has a place in the conversation, whether you agree with Bill 56 or not. I think most of us would like to know if it's possible to use the Charter preventively to suspend just about any right. It strikes the fancy of a provincial government as being, or a federal government as being in the way of the way that they see society. And third, on the argument that Justin Trudeau needs to recognize that the French language needs to be protected, I don't think that is really in doubt, given the moves that the federal government has taken to treat the French language and its needs in the Official Languages Act as different from the straight bilingualism, French-English, and both are equal.
Yep. Althia, your thoughts on this?
I agree with everything Chantal said. I think, a few things. There is danger, and I think we've talked about this on this program before, about using the notwithstanding clause preventatively. The government has talked about referring the issue to the Supreme Court, but what we saw on Wednesday when Justice Minister David Lametti came out and said the government is going to not shy away from intervening at the Supreme Court. And in fact, he kind of left the door open to possibly intervening in lower courts as well. But with regards to Bill 96 and with regards to Bill 21, which we've also talked a lot about, there is pressure within the caucus a lot of Liberal MPs have their seats in Montreal with allophone and anglophone communities. I think it's also important to note that in this federal context, there is also a provincial context that's a bit of a lesson learned here. Dominique Anglade, who's the leader of the Quebec Liberal Party, had tried to court Francophone voters, in fact, bringing forward amendments to Bill 96 that were deemed even more extremist than what the provincial government was trying to do. And in so doing, a lot of her constituency, her base, Anglophone and Allophone voter base, have abandoned her. And I think that is an important lesson that MPs, Quebec MPs, who represent Anglophone and Allophone communities, want to make sure that the government doesn't do. The other thing that has happened, I think, has changed the reason why the Liberals are taking a stronger stance on this, is that there is discussion within the Conservative Party about taking a stronger stance against Bill 21. And certainly Justin Trudeau does not want to relinquish any, first mover advantage to the Conservatives on this. And so I think that's why we are seeing the government take a much tougher stance than a year ago or 2 years ago on Bill 21.
Elamin?
If this is a tougher stance that the federal government has to offer, then they might as well keep it. It has been sort of continuously frustrating at this point to watch the Prime Minister, a Prime Minister who now has a lot more latitude to say more now that he's sort of given the confidence and supply agreement with the NDP, to not use that latitude that he has. I think that is an interesting development. But, I'm reminded of Jean Chrétien speaking in 1993, talking about how we've become much more British Columbians and Albertans and Quebecois and Ontarians when we need to become Canadians. Like, this is the kind of moment that calls for unifying rhetoric. This is a Prime Minister who's, has had a pretty good history of being pretty good at rhetoric. So it's very frustrating to see him at least not take that road, and let alone sort of using any kind of tougher stances that he has at his disposal, and not using those.
Andrew, you wrote this week about how Bill 96 is about who we are as a country. Talk a little bit about that for people who may not, care particularly about this piece of legislation and the issue.
Well, I think Bill 21 and Bill 96 are both challenges to our conception of the country. It's always a question about how fundamental rights are going to be and whether they're going to apply across the country or not. And we're not the only country to face that challenge. So in the United States, when there were fundamental questions of rights at play with regard to discrimination against minority races, there was arguments made that, look, this is a matter for the states. This is not a matter for the federal government to get involved in. But the opposing school of thought said, no, this goes to the fundamental question of what the American idea is all about. This is about the moral compact between us as Americans. And that argument ultimately prevailed. Well, we're faced with something very similar here. It's not so much Bill 96 or Bill 21 in themselves, both of which are objectionable in their different ways, in my opinion. It's the notwithstanding clause. It's the use of the notwithstanding clause to essentially, as it's been said, create a charter-free zone, at least with regard to certain matters in Quebec. And so basic fundamental rights like the right not to be searched without a search warrant, or the right to be able to profess your religion without being discriminated against in hiring, those rights will not be guaranteed in Quebec, and they will be, to a greater or lesser extent, in the rest of the country. That is a real question we've got to address is, are we prepared to live with that? Are we prepared to say we don't have that moral obligation to each other as Canadians across the country to look out for each other, to protect each other's rights? We're just going to basically leave minorities in Quebec to fend for themselves. So it's the very least they could do to say they would join a court action against one of the bills. It was a much less solid suggestion they would do so on Bill 96 than Bill 21. I think the timing is interesting on the day of the Tory election leadership debate. But yeah, it's late, it's partial, it's the least they could do, but at least it's something.
As an Quebec election looms as well, we should remind people about that too. Chantal, go ahead.
Yes, well, let's take the focus away from Quebec. The issue isn't Bill 96 or Bill 21. It is whether the notwithstanding clause, because if you believe it can be used preventively in Quebec for those two, it can also be used in the same way for a bunch of other rights in any other province. One. Two,
that's right.
The Prime Minister cannot unilaterally say you can't do this. The question has to be put to the Supreme Court, and there is no guarantee that the answer will please people like Andrew and others who worry about this clause. The courts may well say this is something for politicians to debate, yep. And to take it out of the Constitution, you need widespread constitutional agreement. As for Justin Trudeau's so-called means to do more, there is something called the disallowance power in the Constitution. There is no consensus that it could be used, and all it would lead to, frankly, from where I sit, is a major court battle between the federal government and the Quebec government, and I am not certain that the federal government would win that one.
15 seconds to you, Althia and Elamin. Really just 15, though.
Disallowance is not going to be used. Chantal is absolutely right. The risk is that the federal government gets an answer it doesn't want, actually, at the Supreme Court, and it makes the problem worse. But also, I think the context is important to remember. François Legault, the Premier of Quebec, wants a fight on these issues with Ottawa, as do the Bloc Québécois, and the Liberals and other federal parties, frankly, have been cautious not to, inflame the situation further by battling with him. So I think that's an important context to remember, that even they may not like it, but their actions have consequences in Quebec.
Elamin, quickly to you.
But there are, I think, bigger consequences to our identity as a nation when you don't when you don't get into that fight, when you don't get into that fight and say, you know what, these are rights that are worth talking about. These are rights that are worth protecting in this particular instance, while we haven't figured out, what the courts are going to do. I think just a stronger articulation of where the nation should be, I think that would be welcome, even if we don't take it to the courts just yet.
Identity cannot be defined by downtown Toronto. Sorry.
He did not say that he would participate in a challenge to Bill 21 before the courts. I see that the federal government has announced that it would challenge the legislation. I would not overturn the federal government's decision to challenge the bill.
Just one of the more heated exchanges between Pierre Poilievre and Jean Charest during the French language debate. All leadership hopefuls were there for the last time on Wednesday. What were the political takeaways? Chantal, Andrew, Althia, and Elamin back for another round. Andrew, I'll start with you. You can pick up on Bill 21 there because I think that's interesting as Poilievre sort of clarified or stated a new position. Althia wrote about that today. But what did you make of it?
First of all, there was only 2 or at most 3 candidates who really should have been on that stage based on the quality of their French or the existence of it. Secondly, I thought Mr. Poilievre must be very confident winning on the first ballot, because he sure doesn't seem to be going for second or third choices of the other candidates. Either that or he just can't help himself, and his just default mode is to attack at every opportunity. He was certainly under attack from the other candidates, but when you're the front runner, usually you try to rise above that fray. But thirdly, yes, the whole party, judging by some of the leadership candidates anyway, seems to be moving a little bit on Bill 21. The prevailing message from the leadership under O'Toole was, well, this is just something for Quebec. We really can't say very much about it. And now even Poilievre is saying, I wouldn't reverse the Liberal decision to take it to the courts or intervene in the courts. Yeah. So that's progress, I guess.
Althia.
It is progress, because up until now, the Poilievre position was that he wasn't going to do anything. In fact, his sole Quebec supporter, MP supporting him, was boasting that Mr. Poilievre was the only candidate who would do nothing. So it is, the Liberals gave him a gift. I don't think they intended to give him a gift, but they gave him a gift by giving him an out to massage his position on that. I agree with what Andrew said. I think the one thing that is really striking from having watched these 3 debates now between all the leadership camps is no matter what happens on September 10th, there is no way there will not be collateral damage after this leadership race. Like the progressive conservative wing of the party, the Brown, the Charest, even the Scott Aitchisons, I don't know how they think that they might have a role to play in a party that is led by Pierre Poilievre. And the reverse is true, frankly. It will be a huge challenge would Mr. Brown or Mr. Charest win to ensure that that wing of the party that has gone to the far right fringe. I mean, I think we looked at what happened to the Republican Party down south and wondered, how did that party go from having moderates to being consumed by the Tea Party likes and then Donald Trump? And it seems like we are watching the same play happening before our eyes, with misinformation used to court more and more potential members. I mean, who knows how long they get involved with the party, but it is really going to be a challenge to keep that party together.
Elamin?
I think that was the thing that was noticeable in that debate, particularly when we saw Mr. Charest and Mr. Brown kind of come closer together in a much more meaningful and unified sense. And maybe the story for them is sort of keeping the Poilievre brand of conservatism out of power. But the long-term consequences for this is, what kind of party do you end up with? And will you be able to keep the factions that you're not criticizing at this point, you're kind of insulting. Like those were sort of the tones of this debate. So it's getting more and more fractious. And, the party did say that they reserve the right to have another debate in August. I'm not sure what kind of shape we'll be in by the time we get there.
Chantal.
Yeah, well, for about a decade, the Conservative Party did really well provincially in a variety of provinces, and the federal Conservatives feuded with each other under 2 roofs. So the notion that the Conservative movement will become Trumpian, I don't totally buy, especially since success seems to come to the Ford types who went the centrist route or the middle-of-the-road route, and Jason Kenney's epic fall from grace. But I think parties will have to think long and hard about the way that they elect their leaders and the fact that they are all captive to special interest groups who decide to use them as vehicles through the leadership process.
20 seconds to you, Andrew, to wrap it up.
Special interest groups and instant members and extremists who are motivated by only one issue. Basically, they're each time they do this, they throw their party open for what the UK they call entryism, where the party is taken over by people who have really nothing to do with the party, and they keep doing it over and over again with repeated disastrous results.
Okay, we'll leave it there. Thank you all. Good to see you this week. Appreciate it.